the level of detail required to support how the controls are designed and how they're operating, it's a challenge, and the level of scrutiny just continues to increase.
The bar of being a public company these days is really high, meaning that there's going to be a lot of eyeballs on your controls, on your reporting, on a multitude of things. How does having a great control environment kind of aid with all of that?
Well, the stronger the control environment, right, the less headaches you're going to have both in your external audit as well as your own financial reporting, right? You're less likely to have errors that you need to clean up if you've got good internal controls already in place.
You know, Todd, when people talk about public companies and they think about SOX and internal controls, it just feels like a lot. Where do they get started?
You know, it's a heavy lift, and unfortunately, Dean, I think most companies underestimate both the amount of time needed and the cost that it will require to get ready to comply with SOX as a public company. Before I even dive into some of the controls related stuff, let's just talk about governance, right? At the board level, you need to have independent directors that are financial experts. So finding those directors and getting them on the audit committee timely is really important, particularly because a lot of times members on the management team may not have a lot of deep public company experience. The CFO might, right, but some of the accounting team might not. So having a director on the audit committee who can really steer the ship in the right direction is super helpful, but it's also required, right? So getting that done as early as possible is important because it takes time. One of the other things besides getting the board ready is thinking about your tech stack, right? Do you have the right systems in place to support you across not just controls, but all the elements of public company external reporting, right? So do you have a solid ERP in place that can support your system? Do you have a good tool for SEC reporting? Do you have the right tool to support you on equity accounting? All of these systems, are essential as kind of a foundational platform to the
Todd, you've told me many times that it's not just the technology, but it's also the talent that pairs with the technology. What does that mean in a controls environment?
In a controls environment, one of the first things you often see in S1 filings is a material weakness related to a company not having adequate, competent people that have public company experience. So, that's not something you want to have to disclose to your investors. Trying to do a talent assessment, evaluating both your current people as well as your needs, right, your gaps. How do you fill those gaps quickly before you go public so that you can avoid that disclosure, which is not fun to make.
When it comes to getting internal control ready, everybody wants to know, what are the common pitfalls? Todd, Let them know.
Well, step one, understand your timeline, right? So whether you're doing an IPO or a SPAC, understand the expected timing of the listing. You need to think about what your anticipated filing status is, and that can be determined by multiple factors, right? The public float element of your market cap, as well as your revenue, influence some of the various filing status categories you can have as a public company. And that determines whether or not you are subject to the external audit for controls, right? So what we call an integrated audit, where your auditors are not only auditing your financials, but you're looking at internal controls, and the auditor will issue an opinion there. So that timeline will basically help you understand how soon do I have to be SOX ready. And from there, looking at controls around IT is super important, because private companies struggle with the level of documentation and governance around IT controls that's needed from a change perspective, from a security perspective. And a lot of the tech companies we work with, Dean, they may have custom in-house systems that influence their revenue cycle, right? And revenue is one of the riskiest areas in the public company sector. So having robust controls around change, particularly when tech companies want to be agile, that's a heavy lift and a cultural shift for a lot of IT departments.
Let's go to the pitfalls around internal controls. What are some other things that companies should be thinking about?
Documenting the controls is a heavy lift, right? and depending on your external auditors, they may have a preference between narratives and flowcharts, or they may want both. And the level of detail required to support how the controls are designed and how they're operating, it's a challenge. And the level of scrutiny just continues to increase. So getting that documentation done early, or at least in relation to when you are up and running on your systems that you're going to use as a public company, is really important. You know, Dean, documenting controls takes a lot of work, and external auditors continue to have increased expectations around what they receive from their clients, right? And a lot of clients think, well, you just sat through a walkthrough on my process. Why can't you document your own understanding? And they will document their own understanding, but they're still going to tell management, hey, I need you to prove that you understand your controls and you can tell us precisely what happens and how those controls are designed and how they're effective. So getting that in place up front can really bridge the gap with your external auditor and get them comfortable sooner. That's an important element of the timeline.
Todd, one of the things that I know have been getting looked at, SEC comment letters or PCAOB findings, is use of experts. Tell us a little bit about that and what can people be thinking there?
Yeah, it can be a challenge for newly public companies because the reason you hire an expert is that you don't have that skill set in-house. But at the same time, management can't relinquish responsibility for the controls around those key estimates or calculations. So developing a process where management can review the work of the expert and get comfortable with it is really important along the way. It's counterintuitive to think if an expert makes an error that management is responsible for that error, but at the end of the day, that's what management is asserting, that they are responsible for their internal controls. Experts and service providers are just, part of the norm these days, and evaluating the controls around the work of experts as well as service providers is a key element of internal controls readiness.
A key element? It seems like it's a must.
It's absolutely a must, yeah.
One of the pitfalls that we hear about is management review controls. I know that's a hot topic right now. Todd, what do you got?
Yeah, this has been an essential component of SOX for a while now, and it continues to get more scrutiny from the PCAOB and external auditors. Controls around complex calculations and estimates are essential, and it's really important that management can show how these controls get to the right level of precision to prevent or detect a material error in those calculations.
You know what everybody wants to know, Todd, is how does a company get started to avoid all these pitfalls that you just talked about?
Yeah, Dean, we talked about one, understanding the timeline and how much runway you have to get ready. The next is defining your strategy around internal audit and a SOX program. And like I said earlier, this is unfortunately one of the last things that companies tend to check off their list, and it may be too late to avoid a material weakness, right? So thinking about your strategy, are you going to have in-house internal audit? Are you going to have co-sourced or outsourced internal audit? If you bring in outside specialists early, you can help move the needle very quickly while you may be trying to hire. So whether you want to do hybrid or outsource all along the way, specialists can help you get there faster.